All right. So the question is, define an HTML markup which satisfies the selector. So what is a selector? Well, the selector has a main element. And again, this is an element because it doesn't have a hash or a dot preceding it. This main element should have any descendant element with this ID. In turn, that element should have P as its descendant. And of course, this is a pseudo element. So this entire definition of CSS rules will be applied to this pseudo element, which belongs to this P element, which is a descendant of any element with this ID, which is in turn is a descendant of the main element. So that is the complete definition of the CSS selector. So let's define that now. So to begin with, we need to have a main element which should have any element which is going to have an ID of my ID. However, although there are many elements that you can put in here, like all the H elements like H1, H2, H3, etc. You can also put a P. You can also put a section. You can put a div, span. All of those are valid elements which can come inside main. However, that element should in turn have P as its descendant. So when you think about the elements which can have P as its descendant, your choices will get limited to div and section. So let's put div. So div, now the div has to have an ID of my ID, and this div should have a P element. And now if I put some content in it, you see that this selector is now applied to this first element because of this definition, and it perfectly satisfies this entire selector definition that we have. So we have the main element, which is the topmost parent, has a descendant div with an ID of my ID. So this part satisfies with these two. And then finally you have the P element and then content inside it. And the first letter of this P element is applied with this definition.